Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi dedicated for Yeshua for Am Yisrael in this difficult times. Today's daf yomi is Bava Kamma Peches, Bava Kamma 88. We're going to start on Peches Amid Aleph, 4 lines from the top. It states in the Mishnah, Chovo be'eved Kenani shal cherem chayev, that if you strike the Eved Kenani, if you wound the Canaanite slave of somebody else, you're going to be responsible in all of the 5 damages. But Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein la'avadim boshes. Rabbi Yehuda says that slaves, Canaanite slaves, do not have humiliation, so you don't pay them humiliation expenses. So it says the Gemara on the top of Peches Amud Aleph, my time with the Rabbi Yehuda. What's the reasoning for Rabbi Yehuda who says that the Eved Kenanim don't have humiliation expenses? It says it's based upon the pasuk, Ki yinatzu anashim yachdav. When 2 men fight together, Ish ve'achiv, a man and his brother. And then the pasuk continues to be the source for humiliation because it says that she sticks out her hand and she grabs a hold of the mevushav in his privates. So, but since it says when 2 men fight, each man versus his brother, be for me, sheyeh shlo achva. This only refers to somebody who has a brother, who has this brother. Yatsa eved she'ilo achva. This excludes a slave who doesn't have a brother, meaning to say, doesn't have a brother from amongst the Jewish people. And Rashi gives 2 explanations. One in the printed Rashi says because he's not able to marry into the Jewish people, the Canaanite slave. But then in Hagos Tziyunim, it has a lashon acher. Why is he Eved not considered a brother? Because he's allowed to marry his sister and the wife of his brother. So therefore, since Eved Kenani is allowed to marry his sister, he's not considered to have a brother. The Rabbanan, whereas the Rabbanan who say the slave does have boshes, it says, Achafu b'mitzvos. How is an Eved Kenani your brother? It means he is your brother with respect to mitzvos. It's because the Eved Kenani is required to do everything that the Eved Ivri, that the Isha is required to do. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, El Me'atu Rabbi Huda, who says that the Eved Kenani is not considered your brother, if that's the case, Zomei Eved will Yarogu. If there are Eidim who are false witnesses against the slave and they testify that he killed somebody when they were lying, well, Yarogu, they should not be killed because it says Va'asisem lo kasher zamam lasos lachiv, and they're not his brother. So Amarava, Amarav Sheshes, Amar Krau, Viarta Rami Kirbecha. No, it says you have to exclude the wicked one from your midst, which means Mikol Makom, even though they're not your brother. Well, if that's the case, El Me'ato Rabbanan, Eved yeh kosher malchus. According to the Rabbanan who say an Eved is your brother, the Eved should be kosher to become a king himself. So, and we know that an Eved is not, because, so the Gemara answers, according to you, Rabbanan, should say a ger should also be kosher to be a king. But not only according to the Rabbanan, but even according to Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Krah, when the pasuk says, Mikerav achicha, when it says, how do you, Som tasim alecha melech, Mikerav achicha, which means from amongst your brothers you should point the king, from the best amongst your brothers. And so that's why we say an Eved and a ger cannot be a king. That's the case. According to Rabbanan, a slave will be kosher to be a witness because they're called your brother. As it says, Vinei sheker ha'ed, sheker ana be'achiv. It says, Vinei sheker ha'ed, he's going to give testimony. He testified falsely on his brother. So if that's the case, according to Rabbanan, who consider Eved Kenani to be your brother, he should be able to be a witness. Amar Ula, Edus Lomatis Amers. No, we're going to say a Canaanite slave cannot be a witness because Asya Edus B'Kavah Chomer Isha, because we're going to learn out as a Kavah Chomer from a woman. Uma Isha, just like a woman. Shehiru Uya Levo B'Kahal, just like a woman who is capable of marrying into the community, is psuo edus, is disqualified to be a witness. Evich Eino Roy of Obakahal, a slave who is not capable of marrying into the community, Eino Din Shapaso Edus. For sure, she should, if just like a woman who is capable of marrying into the community is not kosher to be a witness, a Canaanite slave who is not kosher to marry into the community, shouldn't it be for sure the case that he's disqualified to be a witness? Gemara explains, Mala Isha Shekain Eina Ru'uya Lamila. Gemara says, no. How can you compare this? Compare this to a woman who is not Eina Ru'uya Lamila. Compare this to a woman who is not worthy to be circumcised. How can you be a kal v'chomer from a woman to a slave? A woman's not ru'uya to get a bris. Tomer be'evet shu ra'y lamila. But a slave is supposed to have a bris, a Canaanite slave. So the Gemara says, okay, katan yochiach will prove that a slave cannot be a witness from a minor. Sheyesh no b'milah. A minor does participate in circumcision. Upaso edus, and he's still disqualified. The Gemara says, yeah, but ma'al katan she'eno b'mitzvos, but a katan doesn't have to do commandments. Tomer be'evet she'u b'mitzvos. The slave does have to do commandments. So therefore, we still don't have the kal v'chomer. The Gemara says, Isha tochiach, a woman should prove it. Sheyesh no b'mitzvos. She's commanded to mitzvahs, upsula edus, and she's disqualified. V'chazar adin, but she doesn't do milah, and we have the katan, but the katan doesn't do mitzvahs. V'chazar adin lori zekri zev lori zekri zev. What's the tzara shava shava? And what's the common denominator? Shekin einam b'kol mitzvahs, that neither one of them has all the commandments. Upsulan la'ayid, but they're disqualified to testify. Afani aviyas evet she'einam b'kol mitzvahs. The slave is not included in all the mitzvahs. And he should also be disqualified. Umar says, what's the common denominator? Shekeno eno ish, but neither one of them is a man. But Tomar be'evet shu ish, but a slave is a man, so he should be able to testify. Now, so derived from a gazlan, from a kal v'chomer from a robber. Mala gazlan shekei masav garmelo. So Gemara says, but don't prove that since a robber can't be a witness, also a slave can't be a witness. Because a robber, actually, his actions are what disqualified him. That's why he can't be a witness. Tomar be'evet, but are you going to make a kal v'chomer to a slave? She'im masav garmelo, the slave's actions are not what caused him to be disqualified. So learn that from a robber and from one of the following two, either Isha or a katan. Mar Bered Ravina Amar Amar Krai. He says, no, I'll give you a different source for the fact that a slave cannot be a witness. It says, Yumsu Avos Albanim. So it says in the pasuk, Yumsu Avos Albanim, that the children that the father should not die on the basis of children, which means Yumsu Alpi Avos She'en Lahem Chayis Banim, that they cannot die from fathers who do not have the yichus of children. So it means to say the Canaanite children are not miyuchostim, they don't have the lineage of the father, the Canaanite slaves, so therefore they cannot be witnesses. Gemara says, because if you want to say it's literally, if you want to say it just literally means that fathers cannot die by the testimony of children, they can't die from their sons. My banim. What does it mean from their children? So that's what it says. They can't die from the ones who don't have the lineage of their children. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, when it says in the continuation of the pasuk that the sons should not die from their fathers, so does that also mean that the children should not so does that mean that the son should that you can't die from sons who don't have the lineage of fathers? Well, if that will be the case, well, that should seem to be the implication that a convert should also be a disqualified witness because they don't have the lineage of their fathers. Gemara says, Amri halchi ahashta. It's not the same thing. So a convert does not have any lineage above, but he does have lineage below. Afuki Eved comes to exclude a slave. The slave has no lineage, not above and not below. Because if you want to be of the position that a convert is disqualified to be a witness, the pasuk could have written, so the pasuk could have written, the pasuk could have written, and we would have been darshaned it just like we said before, which means so v'nichto rachmana, and then the pasuk could have said ubanam yumsu al avos tishmas mine trei, because then it would have been the implication of two things. First of all, chada yumsu banim be'edus avos, that the sons cannot die through the testimony of their fathers. Ve'idach yumsu al pi banim she'en lahem chios avos, which would have implied gers. Ve'evan nafkila, and then we would have just derived by a slave from a kavachomer, from a convert. Miger mager domahu hu dein chios avomata yeshul chios pasol edus. So therefore, Elmi, the cause of Rahman, from the fact that the Torah writes it, the fathers cannot die for their sons. The mashma, yumsu alpi avos she'en chios banim. So it implies that the men cannot die on the basis of their fathers that have no chios banim, which is a Canaanite. This implies that a slave that has no lineage, or above or other below, cannot be a witness. But a convert, since he does have chiyus below, he is kosher to be a witness. So if you want to say, let the Torah just write that the children cannot die for their fathers, and that implication would be that the intent is for the fathers of those sons who are mentioned in the pasuk. Why does it have? Why, if that's the case, why did the Torah just write banim yumsu al avos? So the Gemara explains the mashma yumsu al pi banim she'en lahem chiyus avos. So, which would have implied that it would have implied if he said that the men cannot die on the basis of sons that do not have the lineage of avos, which is the converts. So we could have learned from there that a ger is disqualified. So the Gemara says the reason why I didn't write it like that is I did because of yumsu avos al banim, because of namu banim yumsu al avos, because it's just the narrative or the prose structure of the text. Now the Gemara moves into a story which is connected to our teaching. So the Talmud tells us then it says in the Mishnah, if somebody has an encounter with a chereshot of a katan, with a deaf, mute, insane, or minor, then they're always going to have the worst effect, and they're going to come off worse for it. And the Eved and the Isha, if somebody encounters with a slave or a Canaanite or a woman, it's also bad. And somebody who wounds them is obligated, but those who wound others are exempt, but they can pay later. But let's say the woman was divorced, or if the woman was divorced, then she will have to pay. So we're going to discuss basically the rights to a woman of the assets while she's married to her husband. Ima de Rav Shmuel bar Abba me'Gronya, Abbas Nesibule Rabbi Abba. So the mother of Shmuel bar Abba of Hegronia was married to Rabbi Abba. Kasvinu and Nichse Rav Shmuel bar Abba Bira. So she has, when a woman gets married, she has property that's called Nichse Malug. The Nichse Malug is the property where the husband has the rights to, that she agrees before they get married, that this property is designated, she can designate the property however she wants before she gets married. And if she designates it as Nichse Malug, means the husband has the rights to the fruits of that property while they are married, but she owns the principal. But this case, what did she do? She wrote her assets. She said she said, after I die, she's going to she says, after I die, she writes that she's going to give the fruits of she's going to give her property to her son. Meaning to say, she's saying, my husband is not inheriting it because I'm giving it to my son. And it'll be his after he dies. Now, many commentaries understand that this was her son from a previous marriage, so she wanted to make sure he got his money. So Bazar Dishliva, but then she died. And Azal Rav Shmuel Bar Abba Kamed, we're on top of Pei Chesem base. So Rav Shmuel Abba went Kamed Rabbi Yirmi Bar Abba Uchmei bin Nechsei, and he said, "This is your money. Your mother had given it to you, and said that after she dies, it's going to go to you, and it goes to you." Also Rabbi Abba, but her husband Rabbi Abba Amro Milsa Kamed Rav Oshaya. He went to Rav Oshaya, and other Rav Oshaya Amr's Kamed Rav Yehuda, and Amrlei Achim Shmuel Isha Shemachor B'Nuchsei Lug B'Chaya Bal Mesa Bal Motzim Yanol Kupos. He quotes Shmuel. Rav Oshaya went to Rabbi Yehuda, who quoted as Rabbi Shmuel, who said, no, if a woman tries to sell this Nichsei Melug while she's married to her husband, the husband can go to the purchasers and say, no, I have the first rights to this. And so therefore, I'm the one who basically inherits it. So even though in this case also what Shmuel will be saying, says Rav Oshaya, even though she gave it to him, she has no right to. And so therefore, after she dies, I get it back. Amrullah Kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. So they went back to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, and he said, why did you give it to her son? To Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba. Amar lahu, he said to them, Ana masnisa yadana. He said, I have a Mishnah. The Tanam, because we learned in the Mishnah in Bava Basra. So let's say there's a person who has a son, and he wants to write a contract to his son that his son is going to get his assets after he dies. So let's say he has a house, and he says, my son, I'm giving you my house after I die. He writes a contract. The son is not able to sell the house yet because the house still belongs to his father. And the father cannot sell the house because the house is written to the son. Let's say the father sells it. If the father sells it, we're going to view it as though it's sold until he dies. But let's say the son sells it, then the purchaser does not get it until the father dies. But, says the Gemara, the implication of this Mishnah Bava Basra is Himayas Av Mia Islay Lokech. When the father dies, the purchaser does get it. But Afagav, and that implies Afagav the Mesa Ben B'chaya Av. Even though the son died while the father was still alive, the will also Ben. And it never even arrived at the son's hands. And this. Then the Gemara is explaining. There's a dispute in how we interpret this Mishnah. Like Rabbi Shimon Lakish, who says, "Vochna mesa ben b'chayav to go also ben." It doesn't matter if the father died. If the son died while the father was still alive, that the son never got it. It's still the purchaser will get it after the father dies. It doesn't matter if the father died while the son was alive. Also, ben, that it actually arrived in the son's possession. We're still going to say the purchaser has acquired it. The Inmar we learned. Where's this dispute? If the son sells it while the father is alive, and the son dies, Rabbi Yochanan Amar will Rabbi Yochanan says, under those circumstances, since the son never got it, the purchaser never acquired it. Rish Lakish says, Rish Lakish says the purchaser has acquired it. Rabbi Yochanan Amar will he says the purchaser has never acquired it there. Kikatani masnisin. When the Mishnah says, Machar ben will when the Mishnah says, if the son sells it, the purchaser does not acquire it until the father dies. When the father dies, the purchaser gets it. That's only a case that's only a case where the son didn't die while the father is alive. The also ben, because it did, because in that case, in that case, it never came to the son's possession of because in that case it came to the son's possession of Omesa ben Bechaya Av. But if the son died while the father was still alive, to go Asui de Ben, then it never came to the son. Kimayis Av Nami Leis Leokeach. The Reish Lakish says if the son died before the father died, then once the father dies, the purchaser doesn't get it because the son had never acquired it. Alma Kosavar, we see from here that Reish Lakish is of the position, and this is the key, Kinyan Aperos, Kinyan Aguftami, that since the father still owns the rights to the fruits of the house that he sold, he's still renting it out for rent. So therefore, it's like he still owns it, and so therefore the son has never acquired it, and so therefore he can't sell it. The Kisabin, and when the son sold it, Ravdi Deizabin, he didn't sell what belonged to him. Whereas Reish Lakish says, Kana Lokeach, Reish Lakish is in the position that the purchaser has acquired it. And he says, Kikotani Masnisa, when our Mishnah says, Machar Ben, that when the son sells it, in Lokeach, that the purchaser, when our Mishnah says that if the son sells it, the purchaser doesn't get it until the father dies. But when the father dies, the purchaser does get it. It doesn't matter if the son didn't die, that it actually came into the son's possession. It doesn't matter whether or not the son died in the lifetime of the father, in which case it never came into the son. In both cases, the purchaser acquires it. Alma kasavar. So we see from here, Reish Lakish's other position, Kinyan Aperos, Lav Kinyan Aguftami, that even though the father owns the fruits, he does not still own the property. And when the son sells it, the day kazabin, the son is selling what belongs to him, and so therefore va'anan hashta. And we paskin, says the Gemara, Ben Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Ben Rabbi Yehuda, both Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba and both Rabbi Yehuda. We know that they paskin. This is one of 3 cases in Shas where they paskin Reish Lakish sphere way. And so what does Reish Lakish say? Kinyan Aperos Lafka, Kinyan Guftami, that even though you own the fruits, it doesn't mean you own the property. Kamar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Isak Adaitach, Kinyan Aperos, Kinyan Guftami. If you're going to be in the position that Kinyan Aperos is like Kinyan Guf, Kimayas Av, when the father dies, Umayas Ben Ha'av, and the son had died while the father was still alive, Amai Isle Lokech. If you're going to say that if you own the fruits, it's like you own the property. And we know that Reish Lakish says Kinyan Aperos is Lav Kinyan Guftami. And Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says if you hold Kinyan Aperos Kinyan Guftami, if you're going to say like Rav Yochanan that Kinyan, if you're going to say like Rav Yochanan that Kinyan Aperos is Kinyan Guftami, then Kimayis Av, Umayis Ben B'chai Av, if the father dies and the son dies while the father was still alive, Amayis Leilkeach, Ki Kazabin Alav Didei Kazabin. Why would it belong to the purchaser? So it must be Shema Mina Kinyan Aperos Lav Kinyan Guftami. It must be that Reish Lakish is the position here that Kinyan Aperos is not like Kinyan Guftami, and so therefore, also in this case, we learn the law in the case of Rav Shmuel, because since the husband has the Kinyan Aperos only, but that's not like Kinyan Guftami, so the woman should be able to give it over to her son. So why do we say she can't do it? So that's what they're responding. That's the question on Rav Yehuda. So Ajula Kamed Rav Yehuda. So he says, no, this is what Shmuel said. That this Mishnah, which talks about the father who sells, who writes the possession to his son, Eino Domo Mishnah Seino. It's not similar to our case. Why? My timer. What's the reasoning? Amar Rav Yosef Bishlama Itana Ifcha. Rav Yosef says it would have made sense if it said the following. If it said the opposite. Akosem nechasav la'aviv. That if a person writes his possessions to his father, then then we could say, and if that would have been the case, then we could have said, the implication is the Kinyan Aperos Lav Kinyan Guftami. Then we could have said that if you say that the purchaser gets it, then we're saying that's because kinyan averos v'avke kinyan aguf tami. Just because he has the payros, it's not kinyan aguf. Ella hashet katani akosev nechasav libno. But now that you say that the case is where somebody writes the assets to his son, it's mishum deroy yarshohu. It's because we're saying that this is a case where he is capable of inheriting him, and so therefore, since even without this, so since even without this gift, he would have inherited his son. Therefore, it's not possible to say that the intent of the father was that the son should acquire the assets only after his death, because even without this gift, the son would inherit him. So therefore, the intent was that he was really trying to give to his son the rights to sell it. So Abai says, Atu bara yaris Abba, Abba yaris bara. He says, a father would also inherit his son. It's the same thing. So what's the reason why he wrote it? No, he's giving him a reason why he's giving it to him. He says, I don't want the reason why he's doing it is because he's trying to give his assets to his son. Meaning to say, we don't want somebody else to inherit it after his death. And so we see from here that the father is able to sell it even without the gift. So they wouldn't inherit it. He's doing it so that the other brother will not get it, and so that's the reason. So if that's the case, LMI. So why did Shmuel say that this case is not similar to our Mishnah? So we're going to see that, God willing, on tomorrow's daf. Okay, everybody, we should have an amazing day, and we'll dive in 10 minutes. Shkoyach.